In 1945, thousands of rat catchers worked Europe's streets with ferrets and expertise. By 1965, the profession had simply ceased to exist, erased not by economics, but by a single chemical compound that made their skills instantly worthless. In 1945, rat catchers were everywhere. Paris had 847 licensed professionals. Berlin had more. London's East End alone employed over 200 men whose names appeared in rate books and union registers. Williamson, Pettigrew, O'Connell, each one a specialist in a trade that had existed, unchanged in its essentials, for centuries. They worked alone or in pairs, moving through tenements and warehouses with wire traps, ferrets in canvas bags, and encyclopedic knowledge of rat behavior. Their skill was real. A master rat catcher could read a building's infestation the way a doctor reads a patient, identifying entry points by tooth marks on wood, estimating colony size from droppings, predicting movement patterns based on season and food source. They were necessary. Post-war cities were drowning in rats. Bomb sites across Europe had become breeding grounds. Grain shortages meant rats competed directly with humans for food. The profession wasn't marginal, it was infrastructure. These men belonged to unions. The British Union of Rat Catchers, formed in 1919, had over 3,000 members by 1950. They had apprenticeships. They had standards. A journeyman rat catcher in Copenhagen earned decent wages, equivalent to a skilled factory worker, sometimes more. They had status, however modest. Street signs preserved their memory. Ratkatchergatan in Stockholm still carries the name. Their ferrets had names. Their territories were known to neighbors. For 100 years or more, if you had rats, you called a rat catcher. He came. The problem ended. Then, between 1952 and 1956, everything changed, not gradually, but suddenly, beginning with a compound called warfarin. Warfarin was never meant to kill rats. In 1948, Carl Link's team at the University of Wisconsin synthesized it as a blood thinner for human heart patients. But in 1950, someone, the records disagree on who, noticed what the compound did to rodents. It didn't kill them quickly. It made them bleed internally over days, disrupting their vitamin K metabolism so completely that a single dose could be lethal. By 1952, warfarin was being marketed commercially under the brand name rodenticide. It worked. It worked better than anything rat catchers had ever used. Better than strychnine, better than arsenic, better than the trained ferrets that had taken years to master. And crucially, it was simple. A homeowner could buy it. A grocery store could stock it. You didn't need an apprenticeship. You didn't need to know how to set a trap or read an animal's behavior. You just needed to follow a label. By 1954, second-generation anticoagulants were in development, compounds like brodifacoum, which required even smaller doses and worked faster. The British Board of Trade began licensing them. American pest control companies pivoted overnight from hiring skilled trappers to selling poison over counters. In London, the Rat Catchers Union watched membership decline for the first time in its 300-year history. In Stockholm, cities stopped contracting independent rat catchers. The profession didn't collapse from competition or disease or economic depression. It was erased by a molecule and by the decision made in laboratories and boardrooms between 1950 and 1956 to make pest control something anyone could do. But not everyone agreed it should be. Between 1951 and 1965, the rat catcher simply ceased to exist. Not gradually, almost overnight. In 1951, London's Pest Control Registry listed 847 licensed rat catchers. By 1965, that number had collapsed to 73. The same pattern repeated across every major city. Stockholm had over 300. By 1966, the Swedish Pest Control Union could name fewer than a dozen still working. In New York, the Department of Health's own records show the profession went from a recognized skilled trade to an informal, declining occupation in roughly 10 years. The turning point was 1952. That's when brodifacoum, a second-generation anticoagulant rodenticide developed by the Scottish firm Scottish Agricultural Industries, received its first commercial license in Britain. It worked differently than older poisons. It didn't require the skill, timing, or knowledge that rat catchers had spent years perfecting. A homeowner could buy it, apply it themselves. No apprenticeship, no craft, no rat catcher needed. By 1954, brodifacoum was marketed across North America under trade names like warfarin. Pest control companies didn't disappear, they simply transformed. They became chemical distributors, not skilled tradespeople. The work required no license in most jurisdictions. By the early 1960s. Anyone could do it. Union records from the British Pest Control Association document the anxiety precisely. Meeting minutes from 1959 describe members calling it the death of our profession. They weren't wrong. The profession didn't decline. It didn't adapt. It evaporated, replaced by something that required no training, no tradition, no people. By 1965, the job was essentially gone. The buildings still stood. The rats remained. But the men who had spent generations learning how to catch them, where they'd gone, what they'd become, whether they'd been warned, those stories were almost never recorded. The rat catchers saw it coming and nobody listened. Between 1952 and 1958, as brodifacoum rolled out across Europe and North America, the profession didn't decline gradually, it collapsed. In London, the National Pest Control Association reported 3,400 registered rat catchers in 1945. By 1965, fewer than 200 remained. The gap wasn't filled by unemployment lines. It simply closed. William Hennessy, a third-generation rat catcher from Dublin, wrote to the Irish Times in 1957, "We trained for years. We knew our rats. Now anyone with a packet of poison calls themselves an exterminator. The letters exist. They are angry. They are also almost entirely absent from the historical record, filed away, forgotten, or never reprinted beyond their original publication." Cities felt the absence differently. Stockholm renamed Ratkatchergatan in 1966, officially erasing the street's namesake profession from the map. Paris saw spontaneous rat population surges in the 13th arrondissement in the late 1960s, documented in municipal health reports, but never connected to the sudden loss of professional trappers. The skilled eye for rat behavior, the knowledge of ferret handling, the mathematics of trap placement, all of it vanished into the same hole as the job itself. By the 1970s, a new vocabulary emerged to fill the void. Rat catcher became an insult in working-class slang across Britain and Scandinavia, applied to anyone deemed incompetent or disposable. The word survived the profession by decades, floating untethered from its original meaning. What remained wasn't memory. It was the linguistic ghost of erasure. But in 1961, something peculiar happened in the archives of the Pest Control Institute in London, something the industry kept quiet at the time. The Pest Control Institute in London kept a ledger. In 1961, they stopped updating it. The ledger had names, thousands of them. Licensed rat catchers across Britain, filed by region, by specialty, by the year they registered. Then the entries simply Zazed. No closure date. No notation of retirement or death. The records just ended, as if the men themselves had been erased from the page. Today, what remains of the rat catcher profession exists in fragments. Street names persist. Ratkatchergatan in Stockholm's Södermalm district, named for the men who once worked those alleys. Union membership cards survive in private collections, cardboard documents from the National Association of Rat and Pest Catchers, issued between 1920 and 1959. Photographs exist in municipal archives. Men in vests, leather gloves, holding traps or ferrets, their names lost but their faces preserved. The vocabulary outlived the profession. In London working-class speech, rat catcher's daughter remained slang for gin into the 1990s. In Hamburg, the phrase Rattenmensch, Ratman, persisted as a folk memory decades after the last professional trapper retired. Oral histories, recorded by the British Society of Local Historians between 1978 and 1985, captured testimony from aging men who had spent 40 years in the trade. Their accounts were consistent. The work was skilled, necessary, and then, within 5 years, entirely unnecessary. What we cannot find is harder to explain. No industry study examined the unemployment crisis in 1958 or 1959, though thousands of men suddenly lacked work. No government report tracked their transition to other trades. No newspaper marked the moment when the profession became historical. The speed of erasure was so complete that few seemed to notice it was happening. But in 1963, a retired rat catcher named Frederick Ashton submitted a letter to the Times. It was never published. A skilled trade, centuries old, was obsolete in a single generation. Another file is already open, the story of the lamplighters who vanished the same way. Help us document the jobs the world forgot. Subscribe to the archive.